Hey everyone, welcome back to MangaMinute. I'm thrilled to share my latest recap video with you. If you missed the previous one, no worries, just take a quick peek in the description below for the link. Now, let's dive right in and enjoy.
The carriage rattled along the uneven forest path, each jolt echoing the arduous nature of their journey. Shadows from the towering trees stretched across the road, creating a tapestry of dappled light and darkness. Inside the carriage, tension simmered just beneath the surface. Doyagang sat with a look of profound displeasure, his eyes fixed on the narrow path ahead. This journey was not of his choosing, a reluctant march toward the Green Forest Bandits' main base. The weight of the situation bore down on him, every mile only amplifying his sense of helplessness and frustration. He was bound to a fate that felt beyond his control, and the presence of his unwelcome companion only made matters worse. Across from him, Sanyakran glared with an expression that could have melted stone. Forced into this journey alongside him, she was not one to suffer in silence. Her face flushed with indignation. Her sharp eyes bore into Doyagang, who seemed determined to ignore her. She was a whirlwind of anger and disbelief, her pride bruised by being dragged into this ordeal. The carriage rattled on, but inside, the tension was a storm barely contained. Doyagang's silence only served to inflame Sanyakran further. She had been stripped of her wealth by these very people and now found herself being hauled off to the bandits' lair as if she were mere baggage. Her indignation was palpable, each breath laced with ire. She demanded answers, a justification for her predicament, but all she received was Doyagang's brooding silence. He appeared lost in thought, his gaze distant as he contemplated their dire circumstances. To him, it was clear she had been taken by Poong Cheon as well, dragged into this against her will, just as he had been. But Sanyakran was not one to be ignored. Her voice rose with every word, cutting through the oppressive air inside the carriage. She hurled accusations, mocking the absurdity of their situation, demanding that Doyagang acknowledge her plight. Her disdain was sharp and unyielding. To her, this was an affront that could not be borne in silence. Yet, Doyagang remained unresponsive, his patience wearing thinner with each passing second. Finally, the storm broke. Doyagang's temper flared, the frustration he had been suppressing boiling over. In a sharp command, he called out to Poong Cheon, the carriage driver, his voice ringing with a finality that left no room for argument. Poong Cheon, ever alert to his master's summons, responded immediately. Doyagang's gaze turned to Sanyakran, pointing at her with a gesture of exasperation. The decision had been made. He could endure no more. In this moment of heated resolve, he declared that she would be thrown out then and there. Sanyakran's voice rang out, her fury unchecked and her words laced with scorn. Her anger filled the cramped space of the carriage, a torrent of insults hurled at both Doyagang and Poong Cheon. She made it clear that she would not submit quietly, her contempt for their actions blazing in her eyes. Each word was a defiant lash, daring them to respond, to recognize the force of her rage. Her spirit was fierce, unyielding even in the face of such dire circumstances. Outside, the carriage came to a sudden halt. The horses snorted and stamped, sensing the tension that rippled through the air. Poong Cheon, his face a mask of calm resolve, dismounted swiftly. The reins dropped from his hands as he moved toward the carriage door with an unhurried yet deliberate stride. Inside, the atmosphere shifted, a heavy silence falling as the door creaked open and Poong Cheon climbed inside. His presence was a quiet menace, a stark contrast to the cacophony of moments before. Without a word, Poong Cheon approached Sanyakran. His movements were slow, almost gentle as he reached out and placed a hand on her head. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if he might offer some form of comfort or restraint, a gesture that caught Sanyakran off guard. But in the next instant, the calm shattered. In one swift, fluid motion, he executed his signature technique, 180-degree neck twisting. There was no time for her to react, no moment of realization before the silence descended upon the carriage, absolute and final. The act was efficient, brutal in its simplicity. The fury that had filled the carriage was extinguished in a heartbeat. Poong Cheon released his grip, allowing the silenced Sanyakran slump in the seat. Poong Cheon's voice broke the silence with an assured proclamation, his tone carrying a chilling finality. The declaration was straightforward and without remorse. Sanyakran would no longer be a disturbance. Doyagang, though accustomed to the rough methods of his retainer, found himself momentarily stunned by the sheer bluntness of Poong Cheon's solution. His eyes narrowed as a mixture of frustration and incredulity welled up within him. This was not how he envisioned resolving the situation, and he struggled to articulate his discontent. However, the words caught in his throat. Memories of Poong Cheon's peculiar behavior surfaced, vivid recollections of the man's unyielding loyalty and his self-punishing tendencies whenever he faced reprimand. Doyagang hesitated, recalling the times Poong Cheon would repeatedly bang his head against the ground. A brutal display of penance that only escalated in severity the longer he was scolded. Doyagang clenched his fist, steeling himself. If this was to be the outcome of his admonition, then so be it. He resolved to endure it this time, even if Poong Cheon began his ritualistic headbanging once more. Yet, as he braced himself for the expected reaction, something unexpected happened. Poong Cheon remained motionless. There was no frantic movement, no rush to the ground. Instead, he stood firm, his posture unyielding. Doyagang blinked in surprise, his earlier resolve wavering in the face of this unforeseen defiance. This was not the Poong Cheon he knew, the loyal servant who would self-inflict harm at the slightest reprimand. Curiosity crept into his voice as he questioned the change, bewildered by this uncharacteristic behavior. With a solemn bow, Poong Cheon responded, his voice calm and respectful. There was an air of quiet authority in his words as he declared his intentions. Today marked a turning point. He had resolved to assume the role of a master, to lead rather than follow blindly. It was a decision made with clarity, and it left Doyagang momentarily speechless. The implications hung heavy in the air, the shift in their dynamic both sudden and unsettling. Doyagang's eyes widened, his mind racing back to the events of the previous day. Could it be? Had something occurred to prompt this radical change in Poong Cheon's demeanor? His thoughts scrambled for answers, but he found himself unwilling to delve into the matter further. Whatever had triggered this shift, there was no time to dwell on it now. He quickly barked an order, his voice sharp as he commanded the journey to resume. The carriage lurched forward once more, the wheels grinding against the forest path. The atmosphere inside was thick with unspoken tensions, a new understanding subtly altering the balance between master and his weird guard. Sunyakran, though struck down and silenced, was not entirely gone. Her presence lingered, a flicker of stubborn will that refused to be extinguished even in the face of Poong Cheon's ruthless efficiency. A lament arose from her, a feeble protest at the indignity she had suffered. The cruelty of her fate echoed in those lamentations. Her once graceful neck now twisted grotesquely by the unyielding hand of Poong Cheon. Doyagang, seated nearby, caught the faint utterance. His gaze shifted toward her, a grimace forming on his lips. There was a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, mingled with a touch of reluctant pity. It wasn't just the brutality of what had happened that unsettled him, but the cold finality with which Poong Cheon had carried out the act. The method was precise, executed without hesitation, and yet it left an aftermath that gnawed at the edges of Doyagang's composure. 2 days later, on a quiet Tuesday, the group found a brief respite at a small, roadside inn. The atmosphere inside was warm and bustling, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of patrons filling the air. They had chosen this moment to rest and take their meal, seeking a semblance of normalcy amidst their turbulent journey. As they settled into their seats, waiting for their food to arrive, Doyagang's mind drifted back to the events that had transpired earlier that day, just before they had entered the inn. It had been a necessary, albeit unpleasant, task. Before they could step into the crowded inn, Doyagang had pulled Poong Cheon aside, casting a wary glance at Sunyakran's twisted neck. The sight was unsettling, a grim reminder of Poong Cheon's swift and brutal action. Doyagang, ever conscious of the eyes of strangers, knew that such a conspicuous deformity would draw unwanted attention. The waiter's voice broke the din of the inn, announcing the arrival of their meal with a trembling tone. He set the dishes down, his hands shaking slightly as he arranged the plates. With a final stammered wish for them to enjoy their meal, he quickly retreated a step, his eyes flicking nervously between the group. Doyagang's gaze shifted from the food to the waiter, noting his uneasy demeanor. For a brief moment, suspicion flickered in his mind. Yet, as he looked down at the spread before him, an array of delicacies he hadn't seen in some time, Excitement quickly overtook his wariness. It had been so long since he'd had such a feast, and he pushed the waiter's odd behavior aside as a mere trifle. Perhaps he was just overly sensitive, surrounded as he was by such unpredictable companions. Doyagang raised his voice in an attempt to lighten the mood, urging everyone to dig in and enjoy the meal. However, before he could take his first bite, a sudden commotion erupted beside him. Poong Cheon, always on high alert, had moved swiftly. His hand gripped the waiter's wrist, his expression stern and questioning. The room fell silent, the other patrons casting wary glances at the unfolding scene. Doyagang felt a surge of irritation. What was Poong Cheon up to now? Poong Cheon's voice was low and commanding as he interrogated the waiter, asking how long he had been employed there. The waiter stammered in response, claiming he had worked at the inn for 3 years. Poong Cheon pressed on, his gaze piercing as he questioned the man's unusual nervousness. The waiter's face grew paler, and his words stumbled over themselves in an effort to explain. Doyagang sighed heavily, setting down his chopsticks with a clatter. He demanded an explanation from Poong Cheon, his patience wearing thin. Was this really necessary? Had the waiter done something so suspicious that it warranted this outburst? Released from Poong Cheon's grip, the waiter bowed deeply, his voice still shaky as he offered an apology. He began to explain that his nerves had been due to the presence of the young lady with them, his eyes darting towards Sunyakran. Before he could finish, Sunyakran straightened in her seat, her expression turning haughty. She cut him off with a prideful remark, clearly pleased by the attention. To her, the trembling waiter's words were nothing more than confirmation of her own high opinion of herself. Doyagang, attempting to salvage what remained of the evening, called for everyone to enjoy the meal given the circumstances. He felt a flicker of relief, the promise of a warm bite finally within his grasp. However, just as he raised his chopsticks once more, a shadow loomed before him. Sunyakran's face was drawn into a fierce scowl, blocking his path to the long-awaited meal. Doyagang's irritation flared. He muttered under his breath, questioning what new issue had arisen this time. Sunyakran's voice cut through the room, heavy with indignation. Her words dripped with offense, claiming that she had been insulted. Doyagang stared at her, bewildered. Insulted? He had no idea what she meant. His confusion only deepened as he attempted to make sense of the situation. But before he could voice any further inquiry, Sunyakran's fury erupted. With a swift, forceful motion, she flipped the table, sending their carefully arranged meal crashing to the floor. Plates shattered, and food scattered in all directions. Patrons around them gasped, and the inn's din fell into stunned silence. She shouted, her voice rising in outrage, pointing toward the neighboring table. Doyagang's eyes followed her gesture, landing on the table next to theirs. 7 dumplings. They had only been served 6. This trivial difference had sparked her wrath. She demanded that the inn close up for the day, ready to escalate the matter beyond reason. The scene was chaotic, the inn staff and guests frozen in shock at her outburst. Doyagang's patience, already hanging by a thread, snapped entirely. His dream of enjoying a proper meal, something he had not had in ages, was dashed once more. A seething rage filled him, boiling over at Sunyakran's latest tantrum. Without hesitation, he turned to Poong Cheon, his voice cold and final. He ordered Poong Cheon to silence her in the manner that had become all too familiar. Poong Cheon responded immediately, his movements swift and practiced. He approached Sunyakran, who continued to shout and gesticulate wildly. In one fluid motion, he reached out and snapped her neck, silencing her tirade as quickly as it had begun. The room held its breath as Poong Cheon then began dragging her limp form out of the inn, leaving behind a trail of overturned chairs and spilt food. Doyagang stood, his expression a mixture of exasperation and grim satisfaction. This spectacle had cost them their meal, but at least it had come to an end. Turning to Poong Cheon, who waited at the door with Sunyakran in tow, he gave the order to leave. Gasps and whispers filled the inn as the scene played out before the shocked eyes of its visitors. One patron, his eyes wide with disbelief, pointed towards the doorway. He struggled to find the words, his voice tinged with horror as he commented on what he had just witnessed. The person's neck, twisted and snapped so effortlessly, was a sight that defied all reason. Another patron leaned forward, equally stunned, his voice a hushed murmur. Was such a thing even possible? The room buzzed with a mixture of fear and incredulity, the air thick with the unsettling reality of what they had just seen. As the murmurs grew behind them, Doyegang and his entourage made their way toward the inn's exit. Just as they were about to step out, the innkeeper hurried forward, his face a mask of both fear and desperation. He blocked their path, his hands trembling as he held them up in a gesture of pleading. Despite the chaos and destruction left in their wake, he found his voice, insisting that they settle the bill for the meal before leaving. His eyes darted nervously to the overturned tables and scattered food, clearly understanding the danger in pressing this volatile group but bound by the necessity of his livelihood. Doyegang paused, turning to face the innkeeper. His anger, which had simmered just below the surface, flared up again. He threw a sharp retort back at the man, his voice cold and biting. 6 dumplings. The reminder of the supposed slight was hurled like an accusation, as though the number of dumplings justified the chaos that had ensued. The man, with a face that seemed out of place for his years, stood in grim silence. His childlike features contrasted sharply with the darkness that surrounded him, lending an eerie quality to his presence. He gazed at his subordinate, Hyuk Simsu, with cold, piercing eyes. His voice, though emanating from the appearance of youth, carried the weight of decades, dripping with disdain as he addressed the failure before him. The words fell heavy in the air, cutting through the tension with their brutal clarity. A biting condemnation of the subordinate's meager efforts, a mere petty conspiracy. Hyuk Simsu knelt on the cold ground, his body trembling with fear. Blood seeped from the corner of his mouth, a testament to the violence that had already been inflicted upon him. His voice was weak, barely holding together under the weight of his uncle's wrath. He tried to explain, his words stumbling out in desperation. The unforeseen variable, the woman, had turned the tables quite literally on their plans. It was a miscalculation, a blunder that he had not anticipated. As he pleaded for another chance, the word uncle slipped from his lips, a final attempt to appeal to the thin thread of familial bond that might save his life. Hyuk Simsu's gaze shifted to the man before him, his thoughts swirling in turmoil. The childlike appearance of Jongwang Dongja, his uncle, never ceased to unsettle him. Over 60 years old, yet he retained the face of a child, a grotesque paradox that hinted at a darker past. The rumors whispered that his uncle's unaging visage was the result of a curse, a punishment for consuming human flesh in his youth. It was a face that belied the horrors it had witnessed and the darkness it harbored. To beg for mercy in front of this man was a dangerous gamble. Failure was not tolerated, and Hyuk Simsu knew that if he faltered now, death would be his only certainty. With a trembling heart, Hyuk Simsu lowered his head further, his body sinking into a deeper bow. He pleaded once more, his voice raw with desperation. He vowed that this time he would not fail. His life depended on it, and he would do whatever it took to succeed. Silence stretched between them, a suffocating pause that felt like an eternity. The room held its breath, waiting for the judgment that would seal Hyuk Simsu's fate. Jongwang Dongja, the eternal child, stared down at his nephew. His expression remained impassive, his eyes unreadable pools of darkness. When he finally spoke, his tone was as grim as the shadows that surrounded him. This was the last reprieve he would grant, a mercy extended only because of their blood ties. His voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. Hyuk Simsu was to succeed, or he would face the consequences that awaited those who failed him. Under the stern guidance of his uncle, Hyuk Simsu meticulously laid out the plan to his subordinates. His voice was steady, betraying none of the anxiety that churned within him. He detailed the first phase of the operation. The Shadow Spirit Squad was to draw Poong Cheon far from his current location, creating a diversion that would hopefully leave their target exposed. Once Poong Cheon was sufficiently distracted, Hyuk Simsu's focus would shift to the Yin-Yang twin demons, who were to assist him in confronting the young cult leader directly. As the group advanced towards their objective, Hyuk Simsu's sharp eyes locked onto the target, a young cult leader who was visible through a window on the second floor of a nearby building. The leader appeared contemplative, oblivious to the impending danger. Hyuk Simsu signaled his subordinates to halt their approach, his hand raised to indicate a pause. The tension among the men was palpable, their breaths held in anticipation. Hyuk Simsu's gaze remained fixed on the young leader, assessing the best angle for their strike. He then turned to an archer among his men, who stood ready with a drawn bow. With a precise and calculated gesture, Hyuk Simsu instructed the archer to take aim. The archer's focus narrowed, the arrow poised to strike as he followed Hyuk Simsu's command. To ensure the success of their mission, Hyuk Simsu used telepathy to communicate with his team, his mind relaying a final, urgent reminder. The gravity of the situation was underscored by his words, reflecting the high stakes of their endeavor. He knew this was their last opportunity to fulfill their mission and that failure was not an option. The air was thick with anticipation as Hyuk Simsu's subordinates readied themselves. The plan was set in motion, and every action was a calculated step towards achieving their goal. The young cult leader remained unaware, his presence an unknowing beacon of their imminent attack.